Hey y'all,
What's going on, everyone?
I'm Jay. This is
And I'm
Einstein,
Chris. And I'm Chris the Bird Nerd.
and
And
we
we are
are the
the
Bird
Bird
Brains.
Brains. That one was really slow, Jake. Man,
Yeah,
we got
we'll
it.
see.
We're,
But
we're a little rusty on that. That's okay.
yeah, I'm back in the home studio here, and if you're just listening, you might not know yet, but if you're watching, you might know that there are actually four people on this podcast. So, well, three people and a bird. But
Three and a half.
yeah, who is this handsome gentleman that we've got
So,
here?
so we'd like to introduce Dr. Zach Bell. So, Zach, thanks for joining us, man. We really appreciate it. And Zach had reached out to me in some emails a little while back, interested. He'd watched some of our podcast episodes, and Zach's got a pretty cool background that we're going to highlight here in just a minute. And he wanted to come on and share some of his learnings that he's done in the past through some of his research. So we're gonna read a little bit of Zach's bio just to introduce him a little bit, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of the show tonight. It's gonna be awesome. Super excited. Um, so Dr. Zach Bell, he's currently joining us from Okinawa, Japan. I probably said that wrong, but hopefully I said that right. Um, Originally from the United States, has been what the last 9 years in Japan. Zach, is that right?
Going on 7.
Going on seven, so 6 years. Um, did his post studies in London, where he investigated neuroscience and the perception of the Songbird model system, which is super intriguing, and we're going to get into that in this session, and then also published some of that key research on zebra finches too. So I thought that was really cool. So currently in Japan, he's now focused on wildlife conservation. So Dr. Bell remains passionate about songbirds, which is awesome. I join you right there, man.
Yeah, right
And
podcast for that.
yeah, and the transformative contributions to neuroscience and medicine. So I don't know if you know, Zach, but I currently work in healthcare, so
I
I
see.
work really closely with our neurosurgeon. So obviously it's completely different page what we're going to talk about today, but super intriguing to me because it hits a little bit at home for me. So I thought that was pretty cool. So Zach's eager to share his insights with us on his songbird research and to support private bird keepers. So thank you for joining us, and let's rock it off, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. Bird Brains, Bird Brains. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. Bird Brains, Bird Brains.
Yeah, it's the time thing. It actually kind of works out. So it's late for us. It is noon the next
Yeah.
day for Zach. So we are talking to someone in the future. And if
Yeah. Yeah.
someone
What's the
here,
weather like?
yeah. Speaking of weather, I am currently snowed in Mobile, Alabama. We got 10
Wow.
inches of snow yesterday, which is bonkers. So I'm going a little stir crazy. So it's nice to, even if it's digitally, it's nice to get out and talk to
I mean,
somebody
if
not
you
in my
wanted to be in
house.
the snow, Jay, you should have just come to Utah. I mean,
Yeah, you
geez,
can
man.
keep this. This is not for the birds, is really what it is. But you can keep it. Does it snow
The,
in Okinawa? Probably not, right? You're too far south.
Yeah, it doesn't snow here at all. It rarely, gets. I think once per year, every few years, it might get to 40 degrees, but it's pretty much as cold as it's going to get this year right now, and it's about 60 degrees outside, 60, 65 Fahrenheit, so not too
wow.
cold.
How would that be?
Yeah,
That'd be awesome.
that's what I want. That's what I'm used
Yeah,
to.
you should.
Exactly.
I mean, this is cold for me, to be honest. It's like, we're debating on should we turn the heat on or not, around the house.
Well, it's 9 with the wind chill here right now, which I think is colder than Utah or
You are
close
right
to it.
now.
And but
We're
then
at like 12 degrees right now, so
on Sunday it will be 70 here.
Yeah,
that's
that's
crazy. And
So
Sunday it'll still be probably like 15 degrees here, so
yeah. So all right.
no hope in sight yet for me.
Before we talk about this stuff, we have got to talk about our sponsor briefly. Our sponsor is New Zealand, fantastic pet supply company. I don't know if we can ship to Okinawa, but if especially if you're in the States, use code BirdBrains, get 10%
Yeah,
off seed,
please do.
medication, purchase supplies, nutrition, all the other nutrients, you name it, they've got it. Um, we don't want to spend too much of Zach's time on it today, but go to New Zealand, use code BirdBrains. It's awesome.
Yeah, and they've added some more supplies and products to their website for both large and small birds. And then also, if, aside from the bird topic, Jay, New Zealand also has a reptile section that they're looking to enhance and improve. I know they've got some reptile items on there, and I know Zach, you currently have turtles and tortoises that you're studying and helping out there in Japan. So a little bit of a reptile twist there. If any of those who are watching, they've got more than just bird products, and I think they're trying to expand into the aquatics down the road as well, truly making it a one-stop shop for majority of our animals that we have in our houses. So great company, great products. Get that 10% discount. Go on right now, subscribe to their Bird Brains Perch Box, get you a monthly subscription going with some products coming to your house every month. It's really cool. So
Yeah,
thanks,
and
New
maybe
Zealand.
maybe we start there, Zach. So in the past you've done zebra finches. We're definitely going to get to that here in a minute, but maybe give us like a little 30-second overview of what you're looking at now and how it kind of relates to that previous research that you've done.
Yeah, sure. So what I'm doing now and how it sort of relates is, I think during my research, I realized that keeping pet animals growing up really helped me as a researcher. And I became more interested in sort of the captive keepers and that relationship and all the things that they learn, like you guys and myself know about the animals, but the researchers typically don't have this knowledge. Many times the researchers work with these animals just as a study subject. They don't even think about the animal's natural history or their other behaviors. So I realized that my work was improved because of my interest in pets, and I'd had an interest in uh, reptiles, especially turtles and tortoises growing up. So I began keeping them here in Okinawa because the weather is, really good for having reptiles here. And that sort of made me realize I wanted to do research with them now that I can sort of see their natural behaviors as keeping them as pets. And I thought, wow, this is very much parallels with what I did with the birds. So that's kind of where the two kind of meet, really captive keepers versus laboratory researchers, that intersection.
And do you find a lot of overlap between the turtles and birds as far as I know when we did our little kind of pre-talk, you talked about some kind of similar evolutionary things, like they both don't have teeth anymore. I guess like turtles have a beak too,
Yep.
which I don't really think of it that way, but I guess that is what it is.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting parallels between birds and turtles. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, right? One took to the air and the other one's pretty much locked to the ground. So there's a huge difference there. Although I would argue that turtles also can live in 3 dimensions because they have water, right? So they can also swim in these different directions. But tortoises, for example, or land turtles, they're pretty much locked to the ground. But there's some interesting genomic, or when I say genomics, it just means like all the genes that are within an organism. And so the birds and the turtles, we'll say collectively, have similarities in sort of how they evolved, but not necessarily they didn't evolve the same way. For example, as you mentioned, there's this loss of genes related to teeth that both birds and uh, turtles have done. And you can think that other reptiles have teeth. Lizards have teeth, snakes have teeth, but the turtles don't. So there's a similarity, and there's sort of this loss as probably an adaptation to just feeding behavior, just like birds. But other similarities is they're both quite colorful. That's one thing I think that attracted me to reptiles as a kid, but especially turtles. In many cases, birds are quite beautiful for attracting mates. Turtles tend to be more attractive, I think, just because of our own bias of these beautiful patterns that they have, but really they're probably more for camouflage and being cryptic in their environment. But there are these sort of seasonal fluctuations and color changes in some species, similar to what you would think of as a bird, where maybe the males become more intensely colored, and vibrant during the mating season, whether that's to attract females or it's just a byproduct of the mating itself. But those are some similarities, but other ones would include just the vocal communication. Birds are highly vocal, and people recognize that birds talk to each other. They sing, some sing, but people don't realize that turtles also are highly vocal. You just cannot hear them, and with the right instruments, they have quite the vocal repertoire. So there's a lot of similarities in this sort of vocal communication. Just like birds, some are extremely social, and some are sort of more territorial. There's the same thing with turtles. Some kind of more hang out together or more communal, at least with other species, versus some are very much territorial. So those are maybe some similarities, and then maybe something that Jay you'd mentioned before we started, the age of Einstein. Birds are long-lived animals, and so are turtles and tortoises, and that's a big similarity here, because normally as animals get larger the longer they live. So you can think of an elephant versus a small little mouse that might only live a few years, even under ideal laboratory conditions, a few years. But birds don't follow this same model of body size and age. They sort of fall off of the scale. Actually, before we jumped on here, I pulled out one of these books here. This is called Methuselah's Zoo. Methuselah's Zoo. There's a reference for you there. But they have an image here of a cockatoo named Cookie, I think, and he was 83 years old. If you can believe that, 83 years old. And that's something that I think is really fascinating about birds and turtles and tortoises. Although there's a lot of differences and similarities, these abilities to deal with aging is phenomenal. And birds are probably even more extreme, because one of the major theories around aging is this sort of accumulation of free radicals and damage to the cells because of oxygen in the environment. And birds, we know, are taking in lots of oxygen. They're flying around, and so they're accumulating lots of free radical damage to their cells, but they have developed mechanisms that help them repair any damage, which reduces some of these sort of age-related diseases that other animals might face. And turtles appear to do something similar related to aging. Maybe not with the free radical side, but they've figured out how to live longer in their biology as well. So those are some of the interesting ones
Yeah,
that I find.
it's crazy, Zach, that you mentioned that. We have at our local zoo that we have here in Salt Lake City, they've got an Aldabra tortoise. And
Beautiful.
I believe when I was there last time, I think they said it was 82 years old, something
Yeah.
like that, 82 or 72. It was fairly old. I have a good friend that I grew up with my whole life. He's now close to in his 80s. Got an Amazon parrot that he's had since he was 10 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, I was gonna say I
It's
know an
just nuts.
Amazon that's 86.
And it's like,
Yeah.
and honestly, I would say subpar living conditions at times, to be truthful. But it's really cool, Zach,
Yeah.
that these animals can live long. I've got my cockatiel Mikey. He just turned 18 years old last year, and
Wow.
he's not showing any signs of slowing down. The dude's still full of life and wishing that he had a female to to go nest with. He's trying to breed with my Borks and whatnot, but it would be cool if we could somehow extract that for humans so that we could prolong
Absolutely.
the years of life that we have. But
Absolutely. I mean, that
Uh,
happens all the time. That's a big area of biomedical research is, it used to be, how can we take a laboratory mouse and make it live longer, or what makes it live shorter? But then people started to realize, well, maybe we should study the long-lived animals. And there was pushback because, we can't study an elephant in the lab, right? We can't study, even though this maybe a parrot can live, 50 plus years, the researcher might not live 50 plus years. So how do you extract
right,
meaningful data? And so a lot of this stuff has sort of moved from, maybe there's something in this particular gene or gene set in the bird, and you can maybe extract some of those molecules out of the bird and then put them maybe into a mouse and then say, now does the mouse live longer? These types of experiments where you're pulling molecules from long-lived animals and different mechanisms and trying to put them into more traditional laboratory animals to see, does this have effect on age, something like this.
Yeah, it's crazy. Awesome.
So when you did your zebrafinch research, I guess my first question, if we're going to get into that, is it was on the nominate species. It wasn't on the Timor or any of the subspecies, right? It was on the nominal
To,
Australian.
to my knowledge, yes, there was,
Mhm.
you could purchase those at the time, but we tried to keep the most commonly used one in laboratory settings. So that, if we do an experiment in London, it's the same as someone doing it in Japan. So there's good it can be replicated. That's the main
Yeah,
reason.
and so elaborate on that a little bit, please, 'cause that's another thing you mentioned in our talk the other day. That basically that's another like I guess kind of give us the reasons why zebra finches are good for research.
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, we can maybe go back, in history a little bit. There's really famous, bird song biologists out there that were kind of coming from the field, and people were already noticing that, these birds, these particular songbirds, say in England, I believe it was Peter Marler, who's a very famous songbird biologist, who he was trained by also famous songbird biologists. So there's a strong lineage of people interested in these birds, but
Nice.
he had noticed that the chaffinches there in England, they looked the same in different parts of England, yet they had a slightly different song. And he kind of picked up on this as maybe this some sort of local dialects. But wasn't unclear, is this sort of nature or nurture? What's going on here? And by the time he and others had moved to California, they were noticing that I believe it's the white-crowned sparrows in California also had these regional differences in song. And so this really prompted, well, how do we do an experiment to figure this out? Well, they brought them into the laboratory and they would build what are called the sound attenuation chambers or isolation chambers. And it's a way to basically, you put a lot of foam to make it soundproof. So then the only auditory information going in or that's inside the box will stay in the box. So they would put these birds from different parts of California that had different songs, and they would do sort of a cross-fostering experiment. They could either play the song back with a speaker of a different dialect than maybe where it came from, or they would maybe even swap in different parents, and they showed quite readily that these different dialects they're learned. These are learned vocalizations. They're not innate. These aren't different species up and down California. It's the same genetics, but locally they have their own cultures. And that's really where sort of the medical side starts to unfold, because people realize if this is a learned behavior, how does it work? How does this whole thing learn? And through many studies, they realized they can't learn throughout their entire life, maybe like a canary. But there's sort of a critical period, like with the zebra finches, that there's an early sensory phase where the males are actively learning the song and they're listening. And they're starting to form and store like a template of this song in their brain somewhere. And then over time, they start to practice and sort of imitate the tutor or their father. And it doesn't always have to be the father. Sometimes it can be another bird in the cage with them. But they're trying to imitate this song that they're hearing. And then at some point, they form their own version of the song, which is close to the father's or close to their tutor's, but it's not an exact copy. And it was shown that if you remove the tutor or put the tutor in at different points during this development, they either can or cannot learn the song. And it was also shown very clearly that you could go in and actually deafen a bird. There's different techniques and surgical methods where you can deafen a bird in an experimental setting, where after they've essentially stored this song memory, you can remove the tutor, deafen the bird. They can no longer hear anymore. And then when they start to practice, they can't sing the song because they need the auditory feedback. But then you can deafen a bird, say after 90 days after the song has crystallized or it's sort of become stable in the brain, and they can sing all day even though they can't hear. They can sing a perfect copy. So the brain mechanisms were very well organized, but the deep structures had not been sort of evolved, and really students out of that lab sort of developed the neuroscience of sort of auditory processing, and then sort of this whole vocal learning system, as well as made many parallels with human language. Just as a baby starts to sort of listen to sounds and starts to babble, and then starts to produce string these sort of syllables together into sentences and into a language. People started making these parallels with the songbirds. And the zebrafinch really, or the zebrafinch, I apologize for using both terminologies here.
It,
I've lived
zebra
in
is
both
probably
countries, so
the
I hear both in my head.
it's probably
The
the more accurate
zebrafinch,
term.
the zebrafinch sort of became the go-to model, and it's really for the same reasons other experimental animals are used. They breed well in captivity. They're quite inexpensive to take care of, and there's very easy to tell the sex differences, male and female. So it's easy to sex them quite early on, and then there's they have they're genetically determined, so you can do a very simple biological assay to determine sex even when they're hatchlings. But
That's
that's
crazy.
sort of where they became an interesting model. But as you could imagine, all the sort of diseases that go along with learning languages, brain disorders, auditory disorders, people started to realize we can use this bird to study hearing or speech problems, or related to how a brain develops. These types of things weren't so easily, you know, it was a learned behavior, and I think that's probably one of the key things. It was really learned as a natural behavior that the animals want to do. They're biologically driven to want to learn song, even in isolation. A bird will hear a sound, not maybe in isolation, but if you keep a bird by itself in your home, it will try to pick up elements from its acoustic environment, even human sounds, to try to bring into its song because it wants to learn it, which is very much a good model for learning compared to the traditional mouse and rat models where you're training an animal to do something. It's really you reward them when they do it, you punish them when they don't do the right behavior, and so it's a very different model for learning versus this one over here, the songbird. It's a natural system, and they will learn it readily, and so that's why I think they became a very approach or a model system that was of interest to the scientist at that time.
So basically, like to sum that up, so you have a bird that breeds easily, wants to learn, is pretty easy to take care of and identify, and then is fairly the genome of them is fairly unconfused, I guess is maybe a way to say it. So you're likely to have very similar results if you use zebra finches in California, or if you buy them in England, or if you buy them in Japan. Wherever you buy them, you're likely to kind of get similar outcomes, so that you're removing a lot of I can't think of the stupid scientific word right now, but you have more controls and less uh factors that you can't control.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, yeah, I mean that's they breed easily. They're small, so you can keep a lot
Variables.
together, and they're also another thing is they're quite social animals compared to some model organisms, which are maybe we'd say less social. So they became interesting because of that. There's this whole society that they have. But I just to backtrack a little bit, those dialects that were up and down the California coast were with a wild species. It was a sparrow species. But the zebra finches also have these sort of differences in how they sort of culturally have different songs. I'm sure you guys have noticed, you know, all songs you can tell a zebra finch sound a song, but they're all a little different, and and that's probably by design. And a lot of work has been sort of unnecessarily done to understand the sort of song components. But yeah, they're all same but different.
And Zach, a couple of things that came to my mind while you're talking about this, I thought it was really cool and kind of relating it back into the hobbyist that breeds any kind of finch, really, even up to the parrots. But um, first thing is, it's Jay and I's bucket list. One day we're going to go to Australia so that we can see a lot of these birds. Majority of the birds that Jay and I own are Australian species,
I see.
and I would be super interested to hear a wild zebra finch or zebra finch song compared to what I'm used to hearing in my aviary, and just see how different it is. I feel like I know my birds really well. I could sit in there with my eyes closed and I can hear a song and I know exactly which species it is, right? So I'd be really interested to hear that. And then the second thing that comes to mind is the importance of understanding the impacts of fostering birds out through society finches or other species because of that. Zach, that those babies, they pick up on whatever parent is raising them. They pick up on their song, right? The Lady Gouldian finch is one of the only finches that I know of that does not, Australian species speaking, that does not pick up a society song, but it may tweak the dialect of its tune a little bit towards the society finch. I'm not, I haven't heard any differences between a parent-raised Lady Gouldian finch and a society fostered, and I do have both in my apiary. But my zebra finches, their song is tweaked a little bit. I mean, they still have their unique sound and song, but I can hear a little bit of difference, kind of a society finch tone. Your shaft-tail finches or your long-tailed grass finches very much pick up the society song if they're
Yeah.
fostered. Some of your African finches, your cutthroats, your amadinas, they pick up the society finch song. So it's interesting to hear that in what you guys saw in studies, and we see that too as well with fosters. And so many generations down in captivity, especially using fostering programs, makes you wonder how much of that dialect has been lost of a true wild type song and sounds of that bird, just due to fostering and living with other birds and being raised with other birds, things like that. It's kind of interesting. It's something that came to my mind as you were speaking to that.
Yeah, I mean it's a great point. The cross fostering is one of these cool experiments that researchers do as well. On purpose. When I first moved to Japan, I was doing these cross fostering experiments where we would take basically the question was, can you make a bird sort of bilingual? Like that was kind of at a simplistic level. If you take a zebra finch, a baby, and you put it into the nest of a society finch and you let it sort of grow up, how does it, what does it sing as an adult? And what it'll do is it will sing a song just like the society finch in many ways, but it keeps sort of the tempo of the zebra finch. And so what the scientists in the laboratory that I was working in, they come to the conclusion that what the birds are really doing is there's neurons that are detecting the temporal components of sort of the song. So that's sort of what is the sort of genetic or innate component, but the structure itself is really what's plastic, and that's what's learned. And so these sort of silent gaps in between the syllables is what sort of maintained that sort of innate. But if you're hearing that Bengalese or the society finch, those are the components you hear. And it's quite interesting that this could happen in the wild as well, when some of these birds are sort of communal.
Right.
And even in pet situations. But I can say, like from what I know in most isolation experiments, so if you take a zebra finch and you put it into a box by itself and you raise it up, you feed it, it has everything that it needs to survive without song, which is not good for them, right? But they will still sing some scratchy song that sort of, it's still zebra finchy, but it's not what you would say is a pretty song or a more natural song. But
Sounds
if
like
you
a deaf person trying to talk or something.
yeah, they sound it's really scratchy. It's weird, but you can take two of those, a male and a female, and let them breed, and after one or two generations, it goes back to the wild type song. So the birds know that that's not a natural song, and they learn against their parents. And most of what the songbird world has found is that it's not that they're not doing a good job of copying. There's experimental methods where you can get the bird to copy exactly like the tutor. But what they're trying to do in a group is it's always trying to balance the different sounds and enough that they still feel like they're part of the society or part of their aviary or their group rather. But they're still different enough to be seen as individuals. And so it's sort of, this is my style, right? It's very much American teenager, right?
Yeah.
They want to fit in, but they also want their own image, right? And that's really what the zebra finches are trying to do in many ways. Experimentally, that's been shown across the board. And cross-fostering animals, even if you take that cross-fostered animal and you put it back into a situation where it has a female, again, I don't know if this has been done, but I would guess based on the existing data, the song would go revert back to a wild type. And there's limitations as well about how crazy that song gets in the wild versus in captivity, the songs are actually way more complex because they haven't had the societal pressure and humans haven't selected for them to necessarily sing a particular way. So
So
wild birds are far less diverse, I would say, with respect to their song compared to a wild type. And even if you take a wild female and you put her in if you take 3 cages, you put a wild female in the middle and you give her the option of a wild male song or a captive male, she picks the captive one because it's way more diverse and unique compared to the one that's supposed to fit into society, right?
yeah. So cool. You talked about that. I have a really good example of that. So I have a shaft-tail finch, long-tailed grass finch, that was raised by societies. I had gotten it from a breeder, but it was fostered. It sings like a society finch. Now I have a decent colony of shaft-tail finches. I have 5 breeding pairs, and they're all together in the same cage. So he paired up with a female shaft-tail. They had babies, and I kept 2 of the babies, and because I'm going to incorporate them into the breeding program this coming spring. The interesting thing is so he imprinted on society finches. So he still bred with a female shaft-tail, but anytime I put a society finch in, he's the first one to greet it. Sings the society finch song, but has all of the shaft-tail behaviors. He
Interesting.
bobs his head. He still has the long whistle after he does the shaft or the society finch song or the Binglebee song. But his chicks, one is a male, one is a female. His male chick sounds just like my other shaft-tails, not my society finch.
Interesting.
So it picked
Very.
up, and I don't know if I did have them in a colony setting, right? So I have a few other male shaft-tail finches that are in that same group as them. So I don't know if they learned it from them or if it's kind of what you talked about, that wild, type genetics that kicked in that
Yeah.
brings them back into more of an original song type. But yeah, so very interesting because his babies do not sound anything like a society finch, and the dad still does. It's like an 80% society finch song, and then ends with this long whistle that the shaft-tails usually do, and bobs his head. That's a very common shaft-tail trait. But yeah, his babies
That's
sound more like
fascinating.
my other shaft-tails that were parent raised. So interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say too, we kind of got away from the conversation. Sorry, Einstein has decided to try to feed me dinner. And I appreciate it, buddy, but no thank you. But the I was going to say, so I've had just because of how it's worked out. So like right now I have 2 pairs of zebra finches, 2 or both hens and 1 male are local-ish to me, and one of my males is from Chris. And his male's song is similar but noticeably different. So I would describe it as like you can tell it's the same band, but it's a different song,
Yeah.
if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
And then growing up, even from Mobile to Atlanta, which is only a couple hundred miles, the zebra finches there, the song I got local to there is again, same band but slightly different. So yeah, it would be really interesting to hear the wild type. And then, the other thing, and we haven't gotten to this yet, but the that like we've talked about before, and you mentioned the fact that you saw this and you don't use the color morphs typically for experiments because or for research because with different color morphs come different other traits.
Yes.
And I have also noticed different singing from
yes,
different color morphs.
That's very
absolutely.
fascinating.
And the hens too will sound similar but not the same.
And
Yeah.
many times your more recent color morphs, meaning they're don't have as many generations in captivity of that particular color or mutation. Their songs typically seem weaker and quieter than like a wild type
That's
um,
really interesting.
finch.
Yeah, this is the type of stuff that I really think that why the private keepers and the scientists should have sort of group meetings or some sort of shared symposium to describe these observations, like all of these different song elements from other species. It's extremely fascinating that what you're observing, and it's really worthy of more scientific inquiry, or at least some sort of one-off publication, at least some sort of blog or something where people can reference this material, because it's really good to know. I mean, so many experiments have went into things like, why don't zebra finches or canaries or Bengalese or society, why don't they learn each other's songs, in an open, aviary where they're all mixed together, versus when they're isolated, they will pick up on these elements. This is a huge area of research, and has been for a long time. Even, I can remember experiments where there's 3 cages. In the middle, you put the new little zebra finch who's ready to start learning. He's in his sort of, he's in the pupal stage, I guess. And then on the other side, you have an adult zebra finch that is, a really good song. And then over here, you have a Bengalese or a society finch that has a really good song. And that bird will preferentially pick its own species every time. Maybe not every time, I forget the percentage, but it's high. They always go for their native one. But as soon as you remove the zebra finch, he'll learn the Bengalese. And so it's if you had 3 there, right, what would happen, right? Well, which would he pick, the Bengalese, or would he pick, some other finch or something, right? So it's interesting how they make the decision. This idea of song preference has been, extremely fascinating for scientists, because a lot of it has relevance to human language. When a kid's brought up in a bilingual household, or brought up in a bilingual household, and then they're in another country where there's a third language where everybody else speaks. How do the kids learn this, and what is the rate of learning? These are all fascinating questions that the birds can really, I think, tell us.
All right. On that note, just a little housekeeping explanation here. So we want to talk to Zach a lot. We probably are going to do a whole nother podcast in the future. And it sounds like maybe publish a paper. But the the what we're going to do now is we're going to split this conversation here. We'll let Zach kind of plug what he's doing now. If you want to follow him and his research, and he's got a cool Instagram, that kind of stuff. We'll discuss that now, and then we'll pick up where this conversation left off, and that'll be the other episode for this week. And then it will get Zach back on somewhere in the future, because I'm sure this comment section is going to blow up too. This is
Yeah, it's
so
going to be
much stuff.
awesome.
But all right,
And
Zach.
those that are listening, please drop some comments down if you have questions, curious about Dr. Bell's background, some of the research that he's done, maybe something we haven't discussed in this episode. Yeah, drop some comments down below so that we can have some further future content to bring Zach back and to discuss further with us. So, Zach, where can they reach you, man?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of social media, but I do have a nonprofit in Okinawa, and so if you want to learn more about what our nonprofit does, please see the links. We're really focused on conservation of rare turtle species, but we're merging into the bird world as well, given my interest and background. So please see our Instagram, our YouTube, and our LinkedIn. I think those are the 3 main ones.
Yeah,
And Dr. Bell, I think you sent those in your email, so I'll put those links down below in the chat. I'll add a card here too as well to lead you guys directly to some of those sites.
and
To get in touch.
say the name too, just because sometimes people are lazy and they won't do the little scroll down. But if you give them the name, they'll try to type it in.
Sure. Sure. So the name of the conservation organization is called the Okinawa Kame Center. That Kame is spelled Kame, Kame, which just means turtle in Japanese. So it's like Okinawa Turtle Center, but Okinawa Kame Center.
Right. Very, very cool. All right. Well, this is part 1 of the first episode of Dr. Zach Bell. We really appreciate it. As usual, you can find me and Chris on Instagram, obviously on YouTube, Facebook, and then a few other places. We won't go do a whole long drawn out one this time. If you found us already, you probably can find us again.
Bird Brains
But
Podcast,
Zach,
Chris and Jay.
really
The
appreciate
Bird
you being
Brains
here,
Podcast,
Yeah,
Chris
and
and
thank
Jay.
you.
The Bird Brains
thank you all for
Podcast,
listening,
Chris and
and we'll
Jay.
catch you in the
The
next one.
Bird Brains, Bird Brains. Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. Bird Brains, Bird Brains.